All right, let's jump right in. We've got a crucial security briefing for you today, and this one's pulled straight from the field reports of our contacts at Mystic Investigations. We are talking about home defense against the undead. You know, we've all heard the golden rule, right? A vampire can't cross your threshold unless you invite them in. It's supposed to be the bedrock of supernatural security. But how solid is that foundation? What happens if they decide to skip the invitation and just try to knock the whole house down around you?
Okay, let's dive into this. We're gonna break down the invitation spell's shield to see what it really does. Then we'll look at brute force. What happens when they just start throwing things? We'll compare unholy versus human weapons, expose the single biggest loophole in your defense, and finally, talk about what you can actually do.
All right, first things first. Let's talk about the ground rules of this whole engagement, because your primary protection comes from a really powerful and very old piece of magic. It's called the Global Vampire Invitation Spell, and you can think of it like a supernatural security system that's just hardwired into every single home on the planet. It's this ambient energy field that is specifically tuned to recognize vampiric entities, and it just flat out denies them entry unless a resident explicitly says, "Come on in." This is your first and honestly your most important line of defense. But, and you knew there was a but coming, right? It is not an impenetrable fortress. Not by a long shot. The more powerful, the more determined, or frankly, the more clever vampires have found ways to push against its boundaries. They've learned how to test its limits and find the cracks in the armor. So, how do they test those limits? Well, let's start with the most obvious approach. Good old-fashioned brute force. What happens when a vampire decides to stop knocking politely and just starts punching? A vampire, especially a strong one, can absolutely do some damage to the exterior. They can shatter your windows with a rock. They can kick your front door clean off its hinges. But the very second any part of them tries to cross that threshold, that magical energy field flares to life and, as the Mystic Investigations report puts it, they get bounced off. It is a hard stop. But what about throwing stuff into the house? Okay, this is where the physics gets a little weird and supernatural. Anything a vampire picks up and holds gets imprinted with a bit of their residual energy. The report calls it a dark, unholy aura. Basically, it's their psychic fingerprint. And the invitation spell is smart. It's designed to specifically recognize that vampiric energy. So when a vampire hurls, say, a chunk of concrete at your house, the spell interacts with that aura and basically acts like a supernatural brake pad. And I want to read this directly from the field report because it's fascinating. It says, once the object enters the home, it is exponentially de-energized. What that means is that rock they threw might have enough force to shatter the glass, but its momentum just dies almost instantly as it crosses into your home. It's not going to fly across the room and take someone's head off. Well, usually. And I say usually because, of course, there is one major exception to this rule. See, not all vampires are created equal, you know? If you're unlucky enough to be dealing with a high-generation royal vampire, or maybe just a younger one who's fresh off a major blood binge, their power levels are just off the charts. They can throw something with so much raw initial force that even with the spell's breaking effect, that object can still be absolutely lethal if you happen to be standing right inside the window. And that thought leads us directly to a more calculated and frankly a much more dangerous escalation in tactics. The difference between a vampire using their own supernatural weapons and them using ours. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is it shows a huge vulnerability in the spell. If a vampire tries to burn your house down using their own unholy fire, the spell recognizes that supernatural energy and poof, it snuffs it out almost immediately. But if that same vampire tosses a stick of human-made dynamite through the window, the spell has no idea what to do with it. It can't stop it. The blast might get metaphysically contained, keeping it from leveling the whole neighborhood. But inside your house, yeah, that is still a very, very serious problem. So you have to be asking, why don't they just do that all the time? Well, lucky for us, it really just comes down to pride. The source material calls it an enchanted ego thing.
For a vampire, resorting to crude human weapons is a massive admission of failure. They truly believe they should be able to dismantle you with their own gifts, their strength, their speed, their powers of persuasion.
But that reliance on their own power, on their own superiority, it leads them to exploit the single greatest vulnerability in your entire supernatural security system. And that weakness is you.
So the crucial point is, the spell can't really be broken from the outside, it has to be bypassed from the inside. A vampire can mesmerize a person on the street, a pizza delivery guy, your neighbor, and just command them to do their dirty work. That could be planting a device, or, far worse, just having them knock on your door so you open it, and then they say, "Oh, my master would like to come in." And that's not even counting the humans who, for their own reasons, willingly serve vampires. All of which brings us to the final and most important section of this briefing. Knowing everything we now know, what's your ultimate defense? What can you actually do to stay safe? Okay, first and foremost, daylight. Daylight is your absolute best friend. The vast majority of vampires simply cannot survive in direct sunlight. And forget what you see in the movies and on TV, those magical daylight rings, they are exceptionally rare and usually don't last long. The source even mentions drinking gnome blood as a temporary fix, but yeah, good luck getting your hands on that. So the real takeaway here is just vigilance. The spell is a fantastic tool, but it is not a substitute for being smart and being alert. Because at the end of the day, the greatest threat isn't some monster with superhuman strength trying to break down your door. No, it's a predator with immense charisma and psychic power trying to convince you to open it yourself. And that really just leaves us with one final lingering question. The spell protects your walls, sure, but who protects your will?